It was a quiet morning at Mel's Country Diner, the kind where you could hear the hum of the coffee machine and the soft country song playing from an old jukebox. Earl, an 81-year-old veteran, sat in his usual booth by the window. His hand wrapped around a warm mug of coffee. He was talking softly with Carla, the waitress who'd worked there for years. Nothing about that moment felt out of the ordinary, until the door opened. A biker walked in, big frame, leather jacket, heavy boots, the kind of guy people notice but avoid. He glanced around the room, his eyes landing on Earl. He smirked. "Look at this," he said loudly. "Old man still pretending he's a hero." Carla froze, her tray trembling slightly. Earl didn't react. He'd seen worse in his life, but the biker wasn't looking for peace. He was looking for attention. Before anyone could stop him, he stepped closer and, with one sharp motion, slapped the old man across the face. The sound echoed like a gunshot. The diner fell silent. Forks stopped midair. Coffee cups paused halfway to lips. No one could believe what just happened. Earl didn't move. The sting spread across his cheek, but his calm never broke. He just looked at the biker. A look that wasn't angry but steady, the kind that makes you realize you've made a mistake before anyone says a word. Then slowly, without a single shake in his hand, Earl reached into his jacket, pulled out his phone, and typed 2 simple words. "Come now." The biker laughed, thinking it was over. "What, you calling your friends, old man?" he sneered. Earl didn't answer. He just took another sip of coffee. The silence that followed wasn't ordinary. It was heavy like the air before a storm. Carla wanted to say something, but one of the biker's friends gave her a look that made her freeze in place. Minutes passed. The biker started joking again, pretending nothing had happened, but no one laughed. Outside faintly came the sound of engines, slow, steady, getting closer. No one spoke, but everyone felt it. The veteran kept his eyes on the window. "No need to call the sheriff," he said quietly. "Someone's coming." The biker chuckled, trying to act tough, but something in his eyes flickered. Just a little bit of unease. The rumble outside grew louder. Then the bell above the diner's door jingled. The room turned to look. A man in uniform walked in, strong build, calm face. Behind him, a few others followed, all carrying the quiet confidence of men who'd seen things they didn't need to talk about. Earl looked up and gave a small nod. "Morning, son," he said. The biker's smile faded. "This your boy?" he asked, forcing a laugh. Calvin didn't answer. He just walked closer, his voice steady. "You disrespected an 81-year-old man who served this country," he said. "You think that makes you strong?" The biker shrugged, pretending not to care. "He's just an old man. He can handle himself." "He already did," Calvin replied. "He called me." The diner was dead quiet again. Every person in that room could feel what was happening wasn't about anger. It was about respect. Calvin didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The calmness in his tone said everything. "You've got 2 choices," he said slowly. "Stand up, apologize, and walk out like a man. Or sit there and let this whole town see exactly who you are." The biker shifted in his seat, his tough guy act slipping away. His friends looked uncomfortable, their eyes darting to the floor. Carla stopped pretending to wipe tables. Everyone waited. Finally, Earl spoke, his voice low but clear. "When you get to my age, you learn something about pride," he said. "It doesn't protect you, it blinds you. Respect is what matters. You earn it, and you can lose it." In 1 second, the words hit hard. The biker looked around the room. He could see everyone watching, not out of hate but disappointment. His jaw tightened. Then slowly he stood up. "I was out of line," he said. His voice cracked a little. "I'm sorry, sir." Earl gave a single nod. "Starts there," he said quietly. The biker looked like he wanted to say more, but instead he turned and walked out. The bell above the door rang again as he stepped into the sunlight. His friends followed, silent. Outside, the rumble of their bikes faded down the road. Inside, it was as if the diner exhaled all at once. The tension melted into relief. Carla finally spoke, her voice soft. "Coffee's still warm," she said. Calvin smiled faintly and sat across from his father. "You didn't need me to fight him, did you?" Earl shook his head. "No, I just needed him to see that some men don't stand alone." They sat there in quiet for a moment. People began talking again, softly, respectfully. The young man from the corner booth walked by and said, "My grandpa served too." "Thank you, sir." Earl smiled and nodded. Your grandpa's welcome. As they finished their breakfast, Calvin looked out the window and said, You know, that'll be online by tonight. Earl didn't seem bothered. Good, he said. Maybe someone will think twice before doing something stupid. He took one last sip of his coffee and added, Real strength isn't in how hard you hit. It's in knowing when not to, and that quiet little diner and the one that saw an old man's. Calm turned into a lesson that never felt the same again. The sound of that slap still hung in the air long after the biker sat down. You could feel the whole room breathing differently now, slow, uneasy. The diner wasn't the same warm place it had been 5 minutes ago. Every customer looked over at booth number 4, where Earl sat quietly, still as a mountain. He didn't touch his cheek. He didn't even blink much. Just stared down at his coffee like he was counting every ripple in it. It wasn't fear in his eyes, it was something else. Something steadier, heavier. The kind of calm that made even the loudest man question himself. Across the room, Carla stood frozen behind the counter. Her hands shook slightly, but she tried to act busy, wiping a clean glass that didn't need wiping. Phil, a retired truck driver who came in every morning, whispered to the man beside him, If that were me, I'd have thrown a punch. The old man next to him muttered back, You've never seen real war. Phil, that man's seen enough fights to know which ones are worth having. The biker, Travis, leaned back in his chair, pretending not to notice the stares. He tried to laugh, but it came out forced. Guess the old-timer forgot how to speak, he said, his voice echoing in the uneasy quiet. His 2 friends, both wearing leather jackets with the same jagged skull patch, chuckled weakly. But even they could feel it. Something was off. Earl finally looked up, not at Travis again, but out the window. His phone sat beside his cup, screen face down now. No one knew what message he had sent, but it was enough to make him wait, not react. It was like he knew exactly what was coming. Carla hesitated, then walked over to his booth, speaking in a low voice. Earl, you want me to call Sheriff Beckett? Earl shook his head slowly. No need. Someone's already on their way. The way he said it, calm, certain, made her throat tighten. She didn't know who he had called, but she could feel it in her gut. Whoever it was, they weren't going to take long. Travis snorted from across the diner. You think someone's coming to save you, old man? Ain't nobody walking through that door for you. He said it loud, trying to win the room back, but no one laughed. Even his own crew avoided his eyes now. Earl didn't answer him. He didn't have to. He picked up his coffee again, hand steady as ever, and took a slow sip. The sound of the cup touching the saucer was louder than words. The silence stretched. The air felt thick, like the whole diner was holding its breath. A teenager at a corner booth leaned close to his mother and whispered, Isn't that Mr. Jennings from the Veterans Hall? His mom nodded quickly. Don't stare, just eat your food. But nobody was really eating anymore. Outside, a soft wind pushed a paper cup down the street, rolling it past the diner's window. It was the only thing moving in that still world. Inside, you could hear the clock ticking above the kitchen door, each second dragging longer than the last. Travis tried to act casual again. He waved to Carla for another coffee refill. She poured it, hands trembling just enough that he noticed. Relax, he said, smirking. I ain't gonna bite. Carla didn't answer. She just turned and walked away. Phil cleared his throat from the counter. Travis, maybe you ought to leave him alone. You've done enough. Travis gave him a sharp grin. Don't remember asking for your opinion, trucker. But for the first time, his voice cracked a little at the edge. The room was watching him now. Not with fear, but quiet judgment. He felt it, everyone did, and somewhere beneath his tough grin, he started to feel small. Earl didn't move again, didn't talk, didn't look up. He just waited. And that waiting, that stillness, was louder than anything Travis could have said. Minutes crawled by. The clock ticked, the fan hummed, but every sound in that diner felt stretched thin. Even the sunlight spilling through the windows looked different now. Sharper, colder. Then, faint but unmistakable, came a low rumble from somewhere outside. Not thunder, not traffic. Something else, and heavier, slower, powerful. Phil lifted his head. You hear that? He whispered. Carla did. Earl definitely did, but he didn't look surprised. He just said softly, right on time. Travis laughed nervously. "What's right on time, old man?" But the confidence was gone from his voice. No one answered. They didn't have to, because in that next moment the rumble outside grew louder, steady, deliberate, like engines that weren't just passing by, but stopping. And that's when every single person in the diner realized the old man hadn't called the sheriff. He had called someone else. The sound outside grew clearer. Deep diesel engines, steady and sure. Not fast, not rushed. They moved with the kind of rhythm that belonged to men who didn't need to hurry to make a point. Inside the diner, no one spoke. Every head turned toward the window, waiting. But all they could see were faint beams of sunlight reflecting off something metallic in the distance. Travis tried to laugh again, but even he could feel his voice shake. "Probably just a delivery truck," he muttered, trying to convince himself. But nobody answered. Carla froze behind the counter, the coffee pot still in her hand. Phil leaned back on his stool, eyes fixed on the road outside. And Earl, the old veteran, just sat there, still calm, still steady. He'd been through this feeling before. That thick, slow silence before something big arrives. He didn't need to look up to know what was coming. He'd already lived enough battles to recognize the sound of backup. The engines came closer. Their growl filled the space between words that weren't being spoken. It wasn't just noise, it was presence. It was the sound of a promise being kept. Travis turned toward the window, his smirk fading. "What's that?" he asked, almost to himself. Phil's answer was quiet but certain. "Whatever it is, it's coming here." A couple at the corner booth exchanged nervous glances. The young man whispered, "You think that's who he called?" His girlfriend nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think so." The biker's two friends shifted in their seats, exchanging uneasy looks. They'd never been in a room that quiet before, where one old man's calm could drain the fight out of everyone else. It was strange, and a little terrifying. Carla finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Earl, who did you call?" He didn't even look at her. He just said, "Someone who knows what respect means." Travis barked a short laugh, trying to shake the nerves. "You really think somebody's gonna walk in here and scare me? You must be dreamin'." But his words didn't carry the same bite anymore. His hands were fidgeting with his coffee cup now, fingers tapping the handle, knuckles pale. Earl didn't bother replying. He didn't have to. The diner spoke for him. The thick silence, the heavy stillness. The way people kept glancing at the door like they were waiting for a storm to hit. Outside, the engines grew louder, slow, powerful, deliberate. Then came the faint crunch of tires on gravel. One truck stopped. Then another. And then another. From inside you could see shadows moving beyond the windows, tall shapes, steady, confident. Someone in the back whispered, "Oh my God, that's the National Guard trucks." And that's when Travis finally turned pale. He glanced toward Earl, who hadn't moved an inch. The old man was still holding his cup, taking a small, slow sip of coffee. Not a shake in his hand, not even a blink. Phil leaned closer to him, his voice low. "You sure you don't want me to go outside, just in case?" Earl shook his head once. "No need. They'll come in when they're ready." The way he said it, calm, matter of fact, sent a quiet shiver through the room. He wasn't guessing. He knew. Travis stood up abruptly, trying to sound in control. "I don't care who it is," he said, his voice louder now, forcing confidence that wasn't there. "No one tells me what to do." But his friends didn't back him up this time. They stayed seated, eyes down, like they'd already made peace with how this was going to end. Earl set his cup down on the table, the faint clink echoing through the diner. "You've said enough, son," he said quietly. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even anger. It was something far stronger. Disappointment. The wind outside picked up, carrying dust and the faint sound of boots hitting pavement. Carla felt her heart pounding as she stepped backward toward the counter. She didn't know what was about to happen, but she knew the balance in the room had shifted, and then it came, the jingle of the diner's front doorbell. It wasn't loud, but somehow it cut through every other sound like a blade. The door opened slowly. A man in uniform stepped in, tall, calm, steady. Behind him, more figures filled the doorway, their posture firm but peaceful. Not one of them said a word. They didn't have to. Earl finally looked up and smiled faintly. "Took you long enough," he said softly. The man nodded once. "Traffic was light," he replied. Then his eyes turned toward Travis, who suddenly seemed a lot smaller than before. The diner was silent again, but this time it wasn't tense. It was controlled. The kind of silence that comes when respect walks into the room. Travis swallowed hard, trying to keep his voice steady. Who are you?" he asked. The man's reply was simple. "I'm his son, that's..." When the biker realized those trucks outside weren't just anyone's. They belonged to the men who stood beside this veteran long before today still did now, and in that small-town diner, surrounded by quiet faces and soldiers who didn't need to speak. Travis Murdoch finally understood one thing. When you disrespect a man who's earned honor, sometimes honor comes knocking right back. The small bell above the diner door jingled softly, but it felt like thunder in that silence. Every head turned. Even the clock on the wall seemed to stop ticking. The first man through the door was tall, his uniform crisp but worn from years of service. His face was calm, too calm, like someone who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. Behind him came a few others, all in uniform or military jackets, moving with quiet precision. They didn't speak, didn't shout. They just entered, and somehow their silence filled the entire room. The smell of coffee and bacon mixed with the faint scent of diesel and dust carried in from outside. Carla froze mid-step behind the counter, the coffee pot still in her hand. Phil at the bar let out a small breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The man's eyes scanned the room once, not in anger, but with sharp focus before settling on booth number 4, where the old veteran sat quietly, hands folded on the table. Earl lifted his gaze at last and smiled faintly. "Morning, son," he said. The man nodded once, his tone calm but firm. "Morning, Dad." A wave of whispers rippled through the diner. People started realizing who had just walked in. Earl's son, Calvin, wasn't just a soldier. He was a sergeant in the local National Guard, and every man standing behind him was one of his brothers in arms. Travis, the biker, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The smirk that had been plastered on his face all morning was gone now. He tried to speak, but his throat went dry. "What's this?" he said, forcing a laugh. "You call your army to a diner fight?" Calvin didn't answer. He didn't even look at him at first. He walked straight to his father's booth and stood there for a moment, his shadow falling across the table. "You all right?" he asked quietly. Earl nodded. "Never better." Then with the faintest smile, he added, "But this man here seems to have forgotten what respect looks like." Calvin finally turned his gaze toward Travis, and that look, calm, unflinching, was worth more than 1,000 angry words. He didn't glare. He didn't puff his chest. He just looked at him with the quiet authority of someone who'd led men through real storms. Travis shifted again, eyes darting around the room. His friends stayed silent, staring down at their cups. He laughed nervously. "You gonna arrest me, soldier?" Calvin's voice was low but steady. "No, I'm not the sheriff. I'm a son, and you just disrespected my father." He took one slow step closer. "That's something I don't take lightly." The diner had gone completely still again. Carla's hand trembled slightly as she set the coffee pot down. Phil leaned forward on the counter, eyes glued to the scene unfolding. Earl didn't speak now. He just sat there watching, calm and proud. Calvin didn't break eye contact. "You know what I see when I look at you?" he asked. Travis didn't answer. "I see a man trying too hard to look strong, because deep down he's never met real strength." The biker's jaw tightened. He looked around for backup, but no one met his eyes. Even his own crew avoided him now. The room had shifted, the air heavier, the energy changed. Calvin's tone stayed even, never raised. "You slapped an 81-year-old veteran, in front of witnesses, in a diner full of people who respected him long before you walked in." He paused. "You can't erase that, but you can decide how this story ends." Travis blinked, confused. "What story?" Calvin leaned forward just slightly. "The story people will tell about you. The man who hit a veteran and ran away from the truth, or the man who stood up and owned it." The words landed like small hammers, not cruel but unshakable. Vega, one of the soldiers, stepped forward and leaned against the counter, arms crossed casually. He didn't say a word, but the way he stood said everything. No one in this room was leaving until the right thing was done. Outside, sunlight spilled through the big front window, cutting across the room and lighting up Earl's medals pinned on his cap. The gold shimmered faintly like a quiet reminder of everything he'd lived through, every sacrifice, every lesson. Travis stared at them for a long second. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. Something about those medals made the diner feel smaller, his own voice smaller too. Calvin spoke again, voice low but firm. You think this is about pride or revenge? It's not. This is about respect, something my father earned a long time ago, and something you just threw away in seconds. For the first time, Travis didn't have a comeback. He looked down, eyes flicking toward the door like he was calculating an escape. But every soldier standing near the walls made it clear. He could leave, yes, but not like that. Not without facing the man he'd wronged. Earl finally spoke again, voice calm and deep. Son, he said softly, don't waste your breath on anger. He's young. Maybe he can still learn something. Calvin nodded slowly, but his eyes never left Travis. Maybe, he said, but he's going to learn it today. For a long, thick moment, no one moved. Even the air in the diner seemed to hold still. And then, faintly, from outside, came the distant click of another truck door closing, a reminder that this wasn't just a family moment. It was a lesson echoing through an entire town. Travis looked around one last time. Every face watching him, not with hate but with disappointment, told him the same thing. You crossed a line that can't be undone. He swallowed hard. You done trying to scare me? He said, his voice shaky. Calvin's answer was simple. Not trying to scare you. Just showing you what real strength looks like. Earl took a slow sip of his coffee, calm as ever. And as the silence stretched again, it wasn't fear holding the room anymore. It was respect, quietly returning to the place it had been thrown from. Because sometimes the loudest thing in the world isn't a shout or even a slap. It's the silence that follows when truth walks through the door wearing boots and a uniform. For a moment, nobody breathed. The diner was wrapped in the kind of silence that presses on your chest and makes time stretch. Earl sat steady in his booth, eyes calm. Calvin stood beside him, his hand resting lightly on the edge of the table, not in threat, but in quiet readiness. And across from them, Travis Murdoch, the biker who'd swaggered in minutes earlier. Like he owned the place, now looked smaller under the weight of all those eyes. He tried to grin, but his lips twitched. So what's this? You gonna give me a lecture? He said, his voice cracking just slightly at the edges. Calvin's reply came soft, almost conversational. Not a lecture. Just a moment to decide what kind of man you want to be when you walk out that door. Travis scoffed and leaned back in his chair. You think you scare me? You bring your little army in here and suddenly I'm supposed to beg for forgiveness? He forced a laugh, but no one joined in this time. Even his own crew sat frozen, eyes darting between him and the soldiers. Vega, the tall man standing near the counter, shifted slightly, his arms still crossed. He didn't say a word, but the move alone pulled everyone's attention. It reminded Travis that every man standing here had seen worse than a diner scuffle. Earl finally spoke. His voice was soft but carried through the whole room. Son, there's a difference between fear and respect. Fear fades. Respect stays. You've been chasing the wrong one your whole life. Travis turned toward him, jaw clenched. Don't talk to me like you know me. Earl didn't blink. I don't need to know you. A man shows who he is by the way he treats people who can't fight back. That line hit the diner like a hammer. The waitress Carla stopped halfway through pouring coffee for a customer, eyes glistening. Phil muttered under his breath. That's the truth right there. Travis looked away for a second, his jaw working like he wanted to say something. Anything. But the words wouldn't come. Calvin stepped forward, slow, steady, his boots thudding quietly against the tile floor. He didn't crowd the biker, didn't posture, just stood in front of him, eye to eye. You hit my father, he said, voice low but sharp. 81 years old, a man who fought for this country before you were even born. And you did. It for what, to feel big, to get a laugh? Travis's breathing grew shallow. You don't understand. No, Calvin interrupted, still calm, still firm. I understand perfectly. I've seen your type. Loud when the room's quiet, brave when no one pushes back. The biker's friends shifted uncomfortably. One of them whispered, "Travis, maybe just, let's go, man." But Travis shook his head. His pride wouldn't let him. Calvin tilted his head slightly. "You know what the hardest thing about serving is?" he said. "It's not the fights, not the pain. It's coming home and seeing people who've never lifted a finger for anyone act like they've earned the same respect as those who did." Earl looked up at his son, his eyes soft but proud. He could see Calvin holding himself back, not from anger but from the sadness that came with knowing how far people could fall. Carla's voice broke the silence from behind the counter. "Travis, maybe you should just say sorry and leave. Nobody wants this to get ugly." She wasn't pleading. She was tired of watching someone throw their pride around like it made them stronger. But Travis shook his head again, his voice rising. "You think saying sorry makes me weak?" Calvin met his gaze. "No. I think not saying it proves you already are." The air went still again. You could hear the hum of the old ceiling fan above them. Every eye in that room was locked on the biker now, waiting, wondering. Earl took another sip of his coffee, calm as ever. "You know," he said quietly, "when I was your age, I thought being tough meant being louder than everyone else. Took me a war to learn that the quiet ones, the ones who stay calm when everything's falling apart, those are the real strong ones." Travis finally broke eye contact. His gaze fell to the floor. He didn't know where to look anymore, at the old man he'd hit, or the son standing over him, or the faces watching from every booth. Phil, the retired trucker, leaned back on his stool and said, "If I were you, I'd take the easy way out. Ain't nobody here gonna remember you for saying sorry, but they'll sure remember if you don't." The words hung heavy. Even the hum of the kitchen machine seemed to fade. Outside, through the window, a few townsfolk had started gathering, drawn by the sight of the 3 parked military trucks. Faces pressed against the glass, wondering what was happening inside. Travis noticed them, and for the first time, his tough guy armor started to crack. He realized this wasn't just between him and an old man anymore. This was his name, his face, his mistake, and the whole town was about to know it. Calvin saw it too. He spoke softer now, but every word hit harder. "You've got one chance to fix this, Travis. One. You can stand up, look him in the eye, and do the right thing. Or you can keep pretending to be the biggest man in the room and prove you're the smallest." Vega stepped closer, his tone calm but sharp. "Choose fast. Pride's expensive when you've got nothing left to pay with." Travis's hands clenched on the table. His chest rose and fell with each breath. His friends sat silent. No laughter, no jokes now. Just waiting to see if he had enough left in him to do the one thing that takes real strength. Earl leaned back in his booth, eyes still steady. "We're not here to humiliate you, son," he said. "We're here to remind you. Respect is a two-way road. You lose it, you earn it back. But you start by standing up." Travis looked up, meeting the old man's gaze for the first time since the slap. And in that look, quiet, steady, patient, he saw something that broke him more than any punch could have. Forgiveness waiting to be given. He swallowed hard, jaw trembling slightly. But he didn't speak. Not yet. Outside, the wind rattled the door once, like a reminder that time was still moving. Inside, everyone stayed frozen, waiting to see if the man who'd started the trouble had enough in him to end it the right way. And in that moment, every person in that diner knew this wasn't about a slap anymore. It was about pride, forgiveness, and what happens when a man is finally forced to face the reflection he's been running from his whole life. The diner had never been this quiet before. The clock above the counter ticked softly, and every second felt like a drumbeat. Travis sat there, staring at the floor, his hands locked together on the table like he was trying to keep them from shaking. All his noise, all his swagger, gone. Earl hadn't moved an inch. His coffee had gone cold, but he didn't seem to notice. He was watching the biker with the same calmness that soldiers carry after they've seen enough storms to know when the next one is passing. Calvin stood tall beside his father, but there was no anger left in his face now, just patience and something even deeper. Hope. He spoke quietly. You think strength is about how hard you hit or how loud you talk, but real strength, the kind that lasts, is about standing up after you've done something wrong and owning it. Travis didn't lift his head. He wanted to argue, to throw back some smart remark, but the words wouldn't come. Because deep down he knew Calvin was right. The room was full of people who had seen him at his worst, but none of them were laughing. No one was mocking him. They were just waiting, not for punishment, but for him to do the right thing. Earl leaned forward slightly, his voice calm and low. You know, son, he said, I've faced men overseas who thought power was the same thing as control. But the strongest men I ever met were the ones who could stop themselves from crossing a line. He paused, letting the words sink in. You crossed one today. That doesn't make you evil. It makes you human. But what you do now, that's what decides the kind of man you really are. Carla wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. She'd seen plenty of fights over the years, angry customers, drunks, troublemakers. But she had never seen a moment quite like this. This wasn't about fists or fear anymore. It was about something bigger. Redemption. Phil, still seated at the counter, nodded slowly. He's giving you a chance, kid. Don't waste it. There's folks who'd give anything to have one more shot at doing the right thing. Travis's jaw tightened. He could feel everyone's eyes on him. The waitress, the old truckers, the young couple in the corner, the soldiers standing near the walls. And most of all, the old man he'd hit. He finally looked up, meeting Earl's eyes. There was no hatred there. No smugness. Just a calm, steady gaze, like looking into a mirror that showed you the man you could still become. Travis swallowed hard. You don't know what kind of day I've had, he muttered. Earl nodded once. Maybe not. But bad days don't give you the right to take someone else's peace. Those words landed heavy. Travis rubbed a hand over his face, exhaling slow. His voice dropped to almost a whisper. I don't even know why I did it. Earl's reply was simple. Because you could. That's what makes it wrong. The biker's shoulders sagged. The room stayed silent except for the soft hum of the old refrigerator behind the counter. Calvin took a step closer but didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence and the quiet, watchful stance of the men behind him said enough. Vega, leaning against the counter, finally spoke up, his tone even but firm. I've seen a lot of tough guys out there, he said. But the ones who really scared me weren't the loud ones. They were the quiet ones. The ones who looked a man in the eye and told him the truth no matter how much it hurt. He glanced at Travis. Now's your moment to be one of those men. Travis blinked slowly. He could feel his throat tightening, his pride fighting his better judgment. He looked down again, tapping his fingers against the table. A nervous habit. Then he took a shaky breath. You all think saying sorry fixes everything? He asked quietly. Earl shook his head. No, he said. But it's a start. You can't fix the past, but you can decide what kind of story people tell about you tomorrow. Travis looked around the diner. Every face was waiting, but not out of judgment, out of hope. They wanted him to do the right thing. And that somehow made it harder. He ran a hand through his hair, his voice breaking. I ain't used to this. I don't say sorry. Earl gave a faint smile. That's why it'll mean something when you do. The room stayed still, heavy but peaceful, like the last breath before rain finally falls. Outside, sunlight broke through the clouds, pouring through the diner windows and glinting off the metals on Earl's cap. The gold shimmered softly, lighting the table between them. Travis's eyes locked on those metals again, the ones he had mocked just half an hour ago. Now they didn't look like old metal. They looked like history, earned through pain, sacrifice, and quiet courage. He felt a lump rise in his throat. For the first time, he didn't feel angry. He felt ashamed. Earl's voice came again, gentle as ever. You don't owe me an apology because I'm a veteran. You owe yourself one for being better than what you showed today. That broke something inside Travis. He blinked fast, trying to hide the sting in his eyes. He turned slightly, glancing at his reflection in the diner's front window. A tough biker jacket, a hardened face, but underneath it, a man who didn't like what he saw anymore. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost trembling. What if it's too late to change? Calvin answered before his father could. It's never too late, he said. But it gets harder every time you wait. That line hung in the air like a lifeline, And for the first time since he'd walked in, Travis reached for it. He looked back at Earl, eyes red now but clear. I was wrong, he said slowly. I shouldn't have touched you. I shouldn't have said any of it. He took a deep breath. You didn't deserve that, I let my anger win. The diner stayed silent for a beat, and then softly Earl nodded. Now you're winning it back. No one clapped. No one spoke. But something in that moment shifted under the weight lifted. The kind of quiet that followed wasn't tense anymore. It was peaceful. Earl leaned back, letting the warmth of the moment settle in. Calvin's shoulders relaxed, and even the soldiers around the room softened their stance. Travis wiped his face with his sleeve, stood slowly, and took one step back from the booth. He wasn't proud. He wasn't defiant. He was just human again. As the light caught the edge of the window and the hum of the jukebox filled the silence, the lesson of that morning was clear. True respect doesn't come from fear, or anger, or being the loudest in the room. It comes from humility, from knowing when to stop, listen, and make things right. And in that small diner, surrounded by strangers who had just watched a man's pride crack and his heart open, everyone understood something they'd remember for the rest of their lives. That sometimes, the hardest battles are fought quietly, and the bravest thing a person can do is to say, I'm sorry. The sound that followed wasn't loud. No applause, no cheers, no one even moved. But in that silence, something shifted, like the diner itself exhaled after holding its breath too long. Travis stood still, head bowed, his hands gripping the edge of the table. You could see the struggle in his body, the battle between shame and pride and the part of him that wanted to be better. For the first time that morning, he didn't look like the toughest man in town. He just looked human. He glanced around the diner, at the faces that had watched every second of this moment. Carla behind the counter, tears quietly tracing her cheek. Phil, the old trucker, giving him a slow, knowing nod. The young couple in the corner, holding hands under the table, barely breathing. And then finally, his eyes landed on Earl. The old man hadn't said a word in a while. He just sat there, calm as ever, his gaze steady but kind. The side of his face still held a faint red mark, but somehow it didn't look like pain anymore. It looked like peace. Travis swallowed hard and forced the words out. I was out of line, he said, his voice rough, shaky. Shouldn't have put my hands on you. I disrespected you. And what you've done. I'm sorry, no one spoke. Earl didn't move right away. He just watched him, measuring the weight of the apology, feeling its truth. Then after a long moment, he gave a small nod. That's where it starts, he said softly. Not with excuses, but with honesty. Travis nodded, eyes burning. He didn't look for forgiveness, and he didn't expect it. But the old man's calm tone felt like a second chance. A small one, maybe. But real Calvin, still standing beside his father, finally spoke. You did the right thing, he said. Now go live up to it. Travis nodded again, quietly. He looked down at the floor, then back up at the people in the diner. I'm sorry to all of you, he said. Didn't mean to drag this place into my mess. And then he turned toward the door. The bell jingled as he stepped outside. The sunlight hit his face, harsh and bright. His friends followed, heads low, saying nothing. Outside, a small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk. Townsfolk, curious passers-by. People who'd heard the noise but hadn't dared to come in. When they saw Travis leave, they stepped aside. He didn't meet their eyes. He just walked to his bike, started it, and rode away down Main Street. The roar of the engine fading into the distance until there was nothing left but silence. Inside the diner, the quiet held for a few seconds more before life slowly began to return. The clinking of cups, the scrape of chairs. Someone let out a shaky laugh, the kind that breaks tension more than humor. Carla wiped her eyes and moved toward Earl's booth, refilling his coffee cup with a small, trembling smile. On the house, she said softly. Earl gave her a gentle nod. Appreciate it. Calvin slid into the seat across from his father. For the first time since walking in, he allowed himself to relax. You didn't need me to fight him, did you? He said, half smiling. Earl chuckled, more a warm, tired sound. No, you came to remind him I wasn't alone. That was enough. Calvin looked around the room. You know, Dad, half this town's probably already talking about what happened. Earl lifted his coffee cup. Good. Maybe someone will learn something without getting slapped to find out. Phil turned from his stool, still grinning. Earl, I don't think anybody's going to mess with you for the next 50 years. Earl smirked faintly. They shouldn't have before. That earned a few quiet laughs. Outside, the sunlight streamed through the window again, soft this time, golden. The soldiers began to leave one by one, offering respectful nods to Earl as they passed. Vega stopped by the door and said, "Not every man gets to raise a son who shows up when it matters." Earl's smile deepened just a little. Not every man's that lucky. When the last of the uniforms had stepped out, the diner felt smaller again, quieter but peaceful. Earl and Calvin sat there for a long while, not talking much. They didn't need to. The silence now wasn't heavy anymore. It was full of meaning, full of calm. Finally, Calvin pushed back his chair and stood. "You sure you'll be all right?" Earl nodded. "Been all right for 81 years. I think I'll make it through lunch." Calvin smiled, leaned over, and squeezed his father's shoulder before heading out. Through the window, Earl watched him climb into one of the trucks, the engines rumbling back to life before rolling down the street, steady, respectful, fading away just like the trouble that had started this morning. The diner slowly returned to normal. Customers whispered quietly, some replaying what they'd seen, others just sitting in quiet reflection. But something had changed, not just in the room, but in the people. You could feel it in the way they spoke softer, the way they looked at Earl a little differently, not with pity but with pride. Carla stopped by one last time, holding the check. Earl pushed it back toward her. "Put it on my tab," he said. She smiled faintly. "You've already paid enough for today, Earl." He looked up at her, that small, knowing smile still on his face. "Then maybe let the coffee be for the next man who needs it." She nodded, eyes glistening again, and walked away. Outside, the world had gone back to its slow, peaceful rhythm. The breeze moved gently through Main Street, carrying the faint sound of laughter from somewhere down the block. Earl sat for a moment longer, then finished his coffee and rose from his seat. He placed a few dollars on the table, out of habit, more than need, and tipped his cap toward the counter before stepping out into the sunlight. The morning that had started with a slap now ended in silence, but the kind of silence that meant something had been repaired, not broken. As Earl walked down the sidewalk, a few people nodded respectfully. No one said much. They didn't have to. They all knew they'd witnessed something that would travel far beyond that. Diners, four walls, and a quiet reminder of what respect truly means. Calvin's words echoed softly in Earl's mind as he passed the storefronts. It's never too late. And maybe that was the real story, and not about anger or pride, or payback, but about how one man's calm could teach an entire town the meaning of strength. Because real strength isn't about fists or noise or power. It's about patience, restraint, and the courage to stand for what's right without raising a hand. Earl stopped for a moment at the edge of the street, tipping his cap against the sun. He smiled to himself, just a small, content smile, the kind only earned after a long life of lessons. Then he said quietly, as if to no one and everyone at once, "Respect's a funny thing. You can lose it in a heartbeat, but you can win it back the same way by doing what's right." And with that, he walked off down Main Street, leaving behind not a fight, not a victory, but a legacy, a quiet one. The kind that lingers,